Pick up a bottle of Tabasco. Hold it. 2 ounces of red liquid in a glass container barely taller than your thumb. There is a good chance you have one in your kitchen right now. 700,000 of these bottles roll off a single production line every day. They end up in 195 countries. They sit on restaurant tables from Sao Paulo to Shanghai. They fly aboard Air Force One and travel into orbit with NASA astronauts. And every single one of them traces back to one place, a 2,000-acre patch of Louisiana marshland that is not really an island at all. Avery Island. The name sounds modest. It is anything but. Beneath the surface lies a column of solid rock salt that geologists believe may extend deeper than Mount Everest is tall. Above it, oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. And between the moss and the salt, a factory that has been making the same sauce with the same 3 ingredients since 1868. I came across this story by accident. I was researching Louisiana's Gilded Age families when one detail stopped me cold. The man who created Tabasco sauce never mentioned it in his own autobiography. Not one word. He died in 1890 and his obituary skipped it entirely. Edmund McIlhenny built what is now estimated to be a 2 to 3 billion family empire, and he apparently considered it beneath mention. That did not sit right with me. So I kept pulling at the thread. What came loose was not just a condiment story. It was a story about a banker who lost everything in the Civil War and returned to a ruined island only to discover that the one thing still growing in the wreckage was a crop of peppers nobody else wanted. A recipe he may never have invented himself. A name he possibly borrowed. A former employee who stole his seeds and dragged the family through decades of courtroom warfare. Sons who charged up San Juan Hill alongside Teddy Roosevelt. And a grandson who survived a katana strike to the skull on Guadalcanal. And one spectacularly misguided experiment with South American rodents that unleashed an ecological crisis Louisiana is still fighting today. 5 generations. The same island. The same recipe. They have never sold the company and the family still lives on that island. Chapter 1. The Banker from Maryland. Edmund McIlhenny was not born into money. He was not raised on a plantation. He came from Hagerstown, a small town in western Maryland. And by the time his story was over, he would have built a fortune, lost it completely, and stumbled into something that outlasted him by more than a century. Born in 1815 to a family of Irish and Scottish descent, Edmund headed south as a young man. By the early 1840s, he had reached New Orleans. The city in those decades ran on cotton and sugar. Enormous sums moved through its trading houses and financial institutions daily. And for a newcomer with sharp instincts and no inherited advantages, banking was the clearest path upward. Edmund was good at it. He worked his way into the industry, accumulated capital, and eventually owned 5 banks in the city. For someone who had arrived without connections, without a family name that opened doors, that was a remarkable rise. But New Orleans had a ceiling for men like him. The real power in Louisiana did not sit in bank vaults. It sat on the land. That is where Mary Eliza Avery entered the picture. Her family owned something unusual. Her father, Judge Daniel Dudley Avery, had married into the Marsh family, who back in 1818 had purchased a remote stretch of elevated terrain in the coastal marshlands south of New Iberia. The land rose sharply from flat, soggy surroundings. It was roughly 2,200 acres, covered in subtropical growth and enormous live oaks tangled with Spanish moss. Locals called it Petite Ant's Island, though it was surrounded by bayou, not open water. Nobody yet understood what sat underneath. The Averys operated a sugar plantation there. Enslaved workers farmed the fields. The family lived in a large house accessible only by a narrow road through the marsh. It was isolated, self-sufficient, and by the standards of antebellum, Louisiana, prosperous. Edmund married Mary Eliza on June 30, 1859. They would have 8 children. He moved onto the island and into the Avery household. For the first time, Edmund McIlhenny had both money and land. He had a wife from an established family. He had 5 profitable banks in the biggest commercial center in the South. The Civil War was 2 years away, and when it arrived, it would take everything Edmund had: his banks, his currency, his assumptions about the future. Even the island itself would be overrun by soldiers who were not coming for sugar or peppers. They were coming for something buried just 16 feet below the surface that nobody in the family had discovered yet. Chapter 2. An island worth its salt. There is a reason armies have fought over salt for thousands of years. Before refrigeration, it was the only reliable way to preserve meat on a large scale. It cured leather. It kept soldiers alive on long marches. And by the second year of the American Civil War, the Confederacy was running out of it. The Union naval blockade had sealed New Orleans, which before the war had received millions of bushels of English rock salt annually. That supply disappeared in 1861. Florida set up coastal evaporation stations. Virginia fortified its works at Saltville. But none of it was enough. And Edmund McIlhenny, who had spent 2 decades building a banking career in New Orleans, was watching that career disintegrate in real time. His banks were failing. Confederate currency was losing value by the month. The only tangible asset left to the family was the property itself. Then the ground beneath it changed everything. Workers on the Avery estate had been evaporating brine from a natural spring, producing small amounts of salt in a slow, low-yield process. In May of 1862, while deepening one of those springs, they struck something solid roughly 16 feet below the surface. A Mississippi state geologist named Eugene Hilgard tested samples and found the deposit was nearly pure. It was the first commercially significant rock salt discovery in the United States. The news reached Confederate leadership almost immediately. The governor of Mississippi telegraphed President Jefferson Davis. General Richard Taylor arrived in September to inspect the site in person. State agents from Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi followed within weeks. Judge Avery, Edmund's father-in-law, placed the operation at the disposal of the government. His son, John Marsh Avery, received an exemption from military service to manage extraction. 10 pits were opened across the property. Hundreds of laborious worked around the clock pulling salt from the ground while wagon teams from across the South lined up to haul it away. Before the blockade, imported salt had cost a fraction of a cent per pound. Now it sold for 4. In less than a year, the operation produced over 22 million pounds, supplying Confederate garrisons at Vicksburg, Port Hudson, and across the lower southern states. Edmund's role during this period was not on the property. He had taken a civilian position with the Confederate military, first as a clerk in a commissary office, then as a financial agent for the Army paymaster. It was practical work for a banker whose banks no longer existed. But whatever security the salt operation might have offered his family was about to disappear. In November of 1862, 2 Federal gunboats in a transport ship attempted to reach the property by water. Confederate defenders held them off. 5 months later, in April of 1863, General Nathaniel Banks launched a land campaign through the Bayou-Teche region. On April 16, his troops reached the estate and met almost no resistance. They burned all 18 buildings connected to the works, smashed the engines and equipment, broke apart 600 barrels of salt waiting for shipment. The operation that had supplied Southern armies for nearly a year was gone in an afternoon. The family fled to Texas for the duration of the war. Except for 2 Avery sons who served as Confederate officers, the entire household, Avery's and Manny's together, left the property behind. When the war ended in 1865, they came home to a different world. The sugar fields had gone to seed. The salt works were rubble. The enslaved workforce was free. Edmund's banking wealth had vanished with the Confederacy. He was approaching 50 with a wife, 8 children, and nothing that produced income. But before the family had fled, Edmund had planted a small crop of red peppers in the garden, a variety believed to have originated in the Mexican state of Tabasco. Against all odds, those plants had survived the occupation, the neglect, and the years of abandonment. When the family returned, the peppers were still growing. Nobody else would have given them a second look. Chapter 3. The recipe he never claimed. Ask the Many family how Tabasco sauce was invented, and the answer is simple. Edmund came home from the war, found peppers in the garden, and made a sauce. A self-made man, a ruined economy, and a stroke of genius born from desperation. The truth requires more asterisks than that. 20 years before Edmund ever touched a Tabasco pepper, a New Orleans plantation owner named Monell White was already growing the same variety at Deer Range, his estate along the Mississippi. By 1849, White was cultivating them extensively and serving a homemade pepper sauce at dinner parties that were famous across Louisiana society. A letter published in the New Orleans Daily Delta in January of 1850 credited him with introducing the pepper to the region. He shared bottles freely with friends and associates. One of those associates was Edmund. The two men knew each other. What remains in dispute is how much White shared before his death in 1862. Court testimony recorded decades later described a claim that White had given pods and his recipe to Edmund during a visit to Deer Range. The Many family has always rejected that account. Their version is that Edmund obtained his seeds independently, perhaps from a soldier returning from the Mexican-American War. But the timeline is awkward. Edmund did not live on the Avery property until 1860, a year after his marriage. No record places him growing peppers before that date. What is beyond question is that Edmund's method was entirely his own. White boiled his peppers. Edmund fermented them. Sometime around 1866, working in the remains of a kitchen garden, he crushed the ripest peppers he could find into a coarse mash, mixed in a heavy proportion of salt from the ground beneath the property, and packed the mixture into containers to sit. He left it to ferment rather than cooking it down. When the aging was complete, he stirred in French white wine vinegar, blended the liquid by hand over several days, then strained out the solids. The result was too concentrated to pour. So Edmund went to a glassware supplier in New Orleans and acquired small cologne bottles, the kind designed for perfume, and fitted each with a narrow sprinkle atop. You shook the sauce out in drops. It was portion control before the term existed. He started by calling it petite ant sauce after the old French name for the property. That name carried no weight. He switched to a single word instead. Tabasco, a state in southern Mexico. At that time, the peppers themselves were not commonly known by that name. The label would come later, applied backward because of the sauce. Edmund did not name his product after the pepper. The pepper was named after his product. He tested it on family and friends first. The response convinced him to go commercial. In 1868, he grew his first dedicated crop. In 1870, he secured a patent for the method, not for the sauce, for the process of crushing, salting, fermenting, and straining. A technique, not just a recipe. Monell White's version of pepper sauce had already vanished from shelves by the late 1860s within a few years of his death. Nobody carried it forward. Edmund's version survived because of what he had added to the concept. The fermentation instead of boiling, the controlled dispenser instead of an open bottle, the single foreign word that stuck in memory. Those details are the gap between a product that disappears and one that does not. And yet Edmund himself never seemed to regard any of it as important. He composed an autobiographical sketch toward the end of his life and left the sauce out of it entirely. His obituaries in 1890 did not mention it. Whatever he believed his legacy would be, a 2-ounce bottle of fermented pepper liquid was apparently not it. His sons looked at the same product and recognized what their father had missed. Chapter 4. 658 bottles. Imagine trying to sell a product nobody has tasted from a place nobody can reach. That was Edmund McIlhenny in 1869. A middle-aged former banker on a remote salt dome in the Louisiana marshlands trying to convince grocerists to pay $1 for 2 ounces of pepper sauce in a bottle the size of a cologne flask. He had no distribution network, no advertising budget, and no employees beyond his own household. In 1868, he grew his first full commercial crop. He filled each bottle, CKED it, and sealed it with green wax. The following year, he shipped his first batch, 658 bottles, $1 apiece, wholesale. He sent them to grocers along the Gulf Coast, concentrating on the city where he had once run 5 banks. 658 bottles is not a business. It is a bet. The total revenue from that first year was less than what one of his banks might have processed in an afternoon. But the product moved off shelves quickly, and Edmund knew what that meant. He pushed outward. Through the early 1870s, he connected with a food distributor named Hazard, one of the largest in the country. Hazard had warehouses, sales teams, and relationships with retailers in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Within a few years, a sauce that had launched from a bio property was sitting on shelves in the biggest consumer markets in America. By the late 1870s, Edmund was shipping across the Atlantic. Heinz had been around for roughly a decade. Coca-Cola would not be invented for several more years. And here was a one-man operation on a Louisiana salt dome exporting pepper sauce to Europe. The product had an unusual commercial advantage that Edmund may have been the first to recognize. The bottles were small. The sauce was concentrated. Consumers used it in drops, not spoonfuls. A single bottle lasted weeks, sometimes months. That should have meant low revenue per customer. But the bottle sat on the table meal after meal, visible, present, constant exposure that no advertising budget could have replicated. By the late 1880s, the pepper variety itself had been formally classified by a botanist as Capsicum futescens variety Tabasco based on specimens Edmund had submitted. A pepper that once went by generic names now carried the name of his source as its scientific designation. The product had reshaped the language around it. No outside investors, no partners, no corporate structure, one location, one product, 3 ingredients. Edmund built the entire operation himself, and he never wrote a word about it. The business grew steadily for more than 20 years, and he treated it the way some people treat a side project that accidentally outlives everything else they do. He died in 1890 at the age of 75. The 2-ounce bottle outlived every other thing he built. Chapter 5. 3 ingredients, 3 years. Walk into the barrel warehouse on Avery Island, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Sharp, sour, vegetal, rows of white oak barrels stretch from wall to wall. Each one packed with pepper mash and topped with a thick crust of salt. Some of them have been sitting here for 3 years. The contents are not spoiling. They are transforming. This is how Tabasco sauce is made. The process has barely shifted since Edmund figured it out in the 1860s. The ingredients have not changed. The sequence has not changed. The barrels are the same type of wood. What grew over the decades was the volume, not the method. It starts in the fields. Tabasco peppers ripen from green to yellow to red, and the company wants only the red ones. Picking at the right moment matters. A pepper harvested too early lacks depth, and one left too long starts losing heat. For generations, field workers have carried a small wooden dowel painted the exact shade of red the company requires. In French they call it le bâton rouge, the little red stick. If a pepper on the vine matches the color of that dowel, it gets picked. If it does not, it stays. No sensors, no spectral analysis. A painted stick and a human eye deciding the quality threshold for a product sold in nearly 200 countries. Once picked, the peppers are ground into a mash on the same day. Salt from beneath the property is mixed in at a specific ratio. Then the mixture goes into white oak barrels, the same wood used for aging bourbon and wine. A layer of salt is packed across the top. The lid goes on and everyone walks away for up to 3 years. The mash ages in those barrels. Salt draws moisture from the peppers. Natural bacteria break down sugars. The raw heat mellows and the flavor shifts into something the original mash was not. Inspectors check for spoilage, but the process is largely passive. Time and wood and salt do the work. When aging is complete, the mash is blended with high-quality distilled vinegar. The vinegar goes in gradually, stirred, and agitated over weeks until it fully integrates. Only then is the liquid separated from the solids, filtered, and sent to bottling. Peppers, salt, and vinegar. No preservatives, no colorings, no thickeners. What comes out of the bottling line today is functionally identical to what Edmund produced on this same ground more than 150 years ago. Major food brands reformulate constantly. They adjust for cost, for supply chains, for shifting consumer tastes. The modern food business assumes that standing still means falling behind. Many company has never accepted that logic. The barrels still sit in the warehouse. The aging still takes years. Nobody in the family has shortened the process to save money or added a filler to stretch the yield. The little red stick still goes into the fields every harvest, and the peppers that do not match still get left on the vine. Chapter 6. The Man Who Never Took Credit. Edmund McIlhenny died on November 25, 1890. He was 75 years old. The obituaries that ran in Louisiana newspapers mentioned his banking career, his family connections, and his standing in the community. None of them mentioned Tabasco sauce. That silence says more about the man than any tribute could. By the time of his death, his sauce was being sold across the United States and exported to Europe. The brand was recognizable. The product was profitable. Grocers reordered it without being asked. And Edmund, as far as anyone can tell, considered the whole thing a practical solution to a financial problem. He had lost his banks. He had lost his currency. He needed income. The peppers were there. He made sauce. It sold. That appears to have been the full extent of his emotional investment in the enterprise. He never gave it a mission statement. He never described a vision for the company. He ran the operation himself, filled bottles, corresponded with distributors, shipped product, and collected payment. It was commerce, not ambition. There is no evidence that Edmund ever imagined to as something that would outlast him, let alone outlast the century. His wife, Mary Eliza, was still very much present when he died. She had been part of the operation from the beginning, and in the immediate aftermath of Edmund's death, she helped manage the transition. But the real question facing the family was straightforward. Who would run the business? And more importantly, did anyone actually want to? Edmund and Mary Eliza had 8 children. 2 of the sons would prove decisive. The eldest was John Avery McIlhenny, born in 1867 on Avery Island. John had been educated by private tutors, then sent north to schools in New York and Massachusetts before attending classes at Tulane and Harvard, though he finished at neither. He returned to the family home in 1890 when his father died, and he took charge of the sauce operation immediately. John was not Edmund. Where his father had treated the business as a necessary chore, John saw something worth building. He looked at the product, at its growing reputation, at the simple but effective distribution network his father had assembled almost by accident. And he made a choice that Edmund never had. He decided to commit. Under John's management, the operation became an actual company rather than a one-man production line. He modernized manufacturing. He increased the volume of advertising. He expanded the number of retail accounts. And critically, he began thinking about the brand as an asset, not just the liquid inside the bottle. Edmund had made a sauce. John was building a name. His younger brother, Edward Avery McIlhenny, known as Ned, took a different path initially. Born in 1872, Ned was drawn to the natural world in ways that had nothing to do with pepper farming. By his early 20s, he had joined a scientific expedition to the Arctic as an ornithologist. He would later lead his own polar expedition before returning to Louisiana. Ned was a naturalist, a collector, an explorer. The family business was not his first calling. But when John left the company in 1898 to volunteer for military service, Ned stepped in. He renamed the Operation McIlhenny Company, replacing the older name E. Many Son. He standardized production methods, redesigned the label, and in 1927 replaced the original cork and wax seal with the screw-top bottle cap that is still used today. Ned would lead the company for 50 years, longer than any other family member before or since. He brought radio advertising to the brand. He created the version of the diamond logo that remains recognizable around the world. Between them, John and Ned transformed what their father had built. Edmund had created a product. His sons created an institution. Edmund had sold sauce to grocers. His sons sold a brand to the world. The difference was not in the recipe. The recipe never changed. The difference was in what the family chose to see. When they looked at a small glass bottle on a table, Edmund saw a source of income. His son saw a dynasty. There is an irony in that. The man who made the sauce never understood what he had made, and the sons who understood it best would spend the rest of their lives defending it, expanding it, and occasionally risking everything they had on its behalf. The company Edmund treated as a footnote would consume the ambitions of every generation that followed him. He might have found that baffling, or he might not have cared. Either way, by 1890, the era of Edmund McIlhenny was over. The era of the Many family had just begun. Chapter 7. The Blacksmith and the Stolen Seeds. Bernard Trappe knew exactly what he was taking. He had worked as a blacksmith on the Many grounds. For years, he repaired equipment and maintained the tools that kept the pepper operation running. He watched mash being packed into barrels and finished product being shipped out by the crate. He understood the process from beginning to end, not because anyone sat him down and explained it, because he paid attention. Before he left, Trappe took pepper seeds with him grown from McIlhenny stock. He started his own crop, and in 1898, he founded BFD Trappe & Sons. The sauce he produced carried a familiar word on the label, the same word Edmund had chosen 3 decades earlier. Trappe put it right on the front of his bottle and began selling to the same grocers in the same markets, targeting the same customers. From the McIlhenny side, this was not competition. It was appropriation. But stopping him proved far more complicated than anyone in the family anticipated. The legal difficulty centered on what the word actually was. Edmund had selected it because it was distinctive and memorable, but it was also the name of a Mexican state. Under American trademark law, geographical terms were notoriously hard to claim as exclusive property. Any producer using peppers from or associated with that region could argue they had a right to describe their product accordingly. The family's first move came in 1906 when John Avery Many filed for federal trademark registration under a new law that allowed companies to protect names they had used exclusively for 10 years. John signed a sworn statement asserting that no other company had used the word to market pepper sauce during that decade. The registration was granted. The sworn statement was at best misleading. Several competing products already carried the word on their labels. Trappe was the most visible, but a man named C.P. Moss operated the New Iberia Extract of Tabasco Pepper Company and had been selling under that name for years. Moss challenged the registration almost immediately. In 1909, the Patent Office canceled it. A year later, a federal appeals court agreed, ruling that the word was geographical and could not belong to one producer. For the Manys, this was the worst possible outcome. The name Edmund had spent decades building into a household reference was now legally available to anyone with a pepper crop and a label printer. The family regrouped and changed tactics. Instead of arguing that the word was inherently theirs, they pursued a different legal theory. Secondary meaning. The argument went like this. Yes, the word originated as a place name. But after 30 uninterrupted years during which the McIlhenny operation was the only company using it commercially, consumers had come to associate it with one specific source. When a customer asked for Tabasco, they meant the Many product. That association, the family's lawyers contended, gave them a protectable right regardless of the word's geographical origin. The courts took years to sort it out. An early ruling in the family's favor came in 1918 when the Fifth Circuit recognized their exclusive right to the commercial use of the word. But Trappy kept fighting. The legal battle bounced between federal circuits and the Patent Office through the early 1920s. Rulings went in different directions depending on the court. At one point, Trappy won permission to use the word on his own labels. At another, that permission was reversed. The decisive ruling came in 1929. The courts barred Trappy permanently from labeling his sauce with the contested word. He could state on the ingredient list that his product was made from Tabasco peppers. He could not put the name on the front of a bottle. The many claim was settled. Trappy's company survived. It continued making hot sauce under its own name for decades, changed ownership several times, and remained a regional competitor. Then in 1991, many company quietly purchased Trappy's bottled sauce division. The family that had spent 30 years in court trying to stop a former blacksmith from borrowing their name ended up owning his entire operation. The trademark fight had cost the family enormous time and legal expense. But what it secured was something Edmund could never have foreseen when he chose a foreign word for his sauce in the 1860s. It proved that a name properly defended could become more valuable than the product it described. Every competitor who entered the hot sauce market after 1929 had to find a different word. The McIlhenny owned theirs. Chapter 8. The McIlhennys who went to war. There is a dented combat helmet on display at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Next to it sits a Japanese katana still in its scabbard. The helmet belongs to a McIlhenny. The dent was made by the sword, and the man who wore that helmet shot the officer who swung it just before losing consciousness on a jungle floor 6000 m from Louisiana. But the many habit of leaving the pepper business to go fight in foreign wars did not start on Guadalcanal. It started 4 decades earlier in Cuba with a charge up a hill that would reshape American politics. John Avery McIlhenny had been running the company for 8 years when the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898. He was 31. He had modernized production, expanded advertising, and built the operation into something considerably larger than what his father had left behind. None of that mattered to him when the call came. John wanted to fight. He tried to raise his own volunteer regiment from the area around Iberia Parish. When that effort stalled, a woman in the Many household wrote a letter of introduction to Theodore Roosevelt, who was assembling his own volunteer cavalry unit. Roosevelt accepted John into what would become the most famous regiment of the war, the Rough Riders. John shipped to Cuba with Troop F. He fought at Las Guasimas and at the battle that made Roosevelt a national figure, the charge up Kettle Hill, often called San Juan Hill. Roosevelt promoted him twice on the battlefield for what he described as gallantry in action. John claimed for the rest of his life that he had pushed Roosevelt out of the path of a Spanish sniper and covered the future president with his own body. Whether that story is entirely accurate remains debated. John had a reputation for embellishment, but Roosevelt never contradicted him and the two became lifelong friends. John served through the campaign despite contracting both measles and malaria. He was discharged as a second lieutenant in September of 1898 and returned to Louisiana, where he entered politics almost immediately. He won a seat in the State House of Representatives, served in the State Senate, and in 1906 accepted Roosevelt's offer to join the United States Civil Service Commission. He held that federal post through 3 presidencies under Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson before accepting a diplomatic assignment as financial advisor to Haiti during the American occupation. His time in Haiti ended badly. He clashed with the Haitian president over economic policy, suspended the man's salary, and triggered a diplomatic incident that drew criticism from the State Department. John retired to Virginia in 1922 and spent his later years helping reorganize the company. He had left decades earlier. He died in 1942 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His career after Cuba had been distinguished, complicated, and almost entirely detached from the hot sauce business. The company had survived his absence because Ned was there to run it. But John's Rough Rider service had given the many name something money could not buy. a connection to Roosevelt, a story of battlefield courage, a mythology that elevated a Louisiana condiment family into something that sounded like American aristocracy. The next many to leave for war carried none of that romanticism with him. Walter Stayameni was John's son, born in 1910 in Washington, D.C., while his father was serving on the Civil Service Commission. He grew up between Virginia and Louisiana, joined the Virginia National Guard in 1931, and transferred to the Marine Corps Reserve in 1935. By 1940, he had started executive training at the company, preparing to eventually take over from his aging Uncle Ned. Then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Walter's plans changed overnight. He spent 31 months in the Western Pacific with the 1st Marine Division. His war was not a cavalry charge in tropical sunshine. It was jungle combat at close range, fought in darkness and mud against an entrenched enemy. On Guadalcanal in August of 1942, Walter led a rescue party to evacuate wounded Marines from an exposed forward position. Armed with a rifle and nothing else, he moved ahead of his men, drew enemy fire deliberately to create cover for the evacuation, and silenced a Japanese machine gun nest. A mortar round concussed him. He kept going. He advanced alone toward enemy lines to relay targeting information back to supporting artillery. He only pulled back when ordered to do so. For that action, he received the Navy Cross. The moment that followed Walter for the rest of his life happened during a night engagement on the same island. He stumbled into a Japanese officer in the dark. The officer grabbed the nearest weapon available, a katana, and swung it at Walter's head. The blade was still in its scabbard. The blow dented Walter's helmet and knocked him off his feet. Before he blacked out, Walter shot the man. When he woke up on a stretcher, the dented helmet and the katana were lying next to him. He kept both. Walter also earned a Silver Star and a Purple Heart on Guadalcanal. He later served at New Britain and at the brutal Battle of Paleo, where the entire 1st Marine Division received a Presidential Unit Citation. He returned to the United States in late 1944. When the war ended, he stayed in the Marine Reserve and eventually retired as a brigadier general. He took over Many Company in 1949 after Ned's death and ran it until his own death in 1985, 36 years at the helm. Under Walter, the company became a genuinely global operation. But his most lasting contribution to the brand may have come directly from his years eating field rations in the Pacific. Walter understood from personal experience that military food was miserable. He also understood that a few drops of pepper sauce could transform a bland ration into something edible. During the Vietnam War, he created a small publication called the Charlie Ration Cookbook. It was a tongue-in-cheek recipe guide explaining how soldiers could combine standard C ration components with Tabasco to produce meals with actual flavor. Each copy came wrapped around a 2-ounce bottle. The cookbook became a cult object among troops in Vietnam. Soldiers who did not receive one wrote home asking their families to send Tabasco in care packages. By the 1980s, the United States military had made it official. Miniature bottles began appearing inside MIs, the individually packaged field meals issued to every branch of the armed forces. The Australian, British, and Canadian armies followed. Walter had taken a condiment and embedded it into the infrastructure of modern warfare, not through a sales pitch, through a shared understanding of what bad food does to morale when you are a long way from home. The dented helmet and the katana sit in their museum case in New Orleans today. Most visitors walk past without reading the placard. They do not know that the man who wore that helmet came home, took over a hot sauce company, and figured out how to put his product into the hands of every American soldier for the next half-century. Walter Many never talked about the war much. He let the helmet speak for itself. Chapter 9. The condiment that left the planet. The same red liquid sits on a folding table in a military mess tent in the Middle East and on white linen at a state dinner in London. It rides in the cargo bay of a space shuttle and in the breast pocket of a line cook in São Paulo. It has been packed into emergency rations, presidential aircraft, and submarine GS. It speaks 36 languages, at least on the label, and it has not changed since the 1860s. There is no other food product on earth with that kind of range. Ketchup comes close, but ketchup has been reformulated dozens of times and exists in countless variations. Mustard has fragmented into 100 regional styles. Hot sauce as a category has exploded into thousands of brands, each chasing a niche. Tabasco has done the opposite. One recipe, one look, one tiny container with a sprinkle atop and a diamond on the label everywhere. How did a 3-ingredient condiment from a Louisiana salt dome become one of the most universally recognized food brands in the world? Not through a single breakthrough, through accumulation, decade after decade of simply being present wherever food was served. The military connection which Walter Many cemented in the 1960s and 70s opened the first global pipeline. American soldiers carried Tabasco to bases and deployments across the globe. When the United States military began including miniature containers in field rations during the 1980s, the product became standard equipment for the armed forces of 4 countries. Australia, Britain, and Canada followed the American lead. Soldiers who used it overseas brought the habit home. The military did not just distribute the product. It created a generation of loyal consumers who associated it with survival, comfort, and the taste of something familiar in unfamiliar places. From there, the reach expanded in directions Edmund could never have predicted. NASA added Tabasco to the menus aboard the Space Shuttle program. Astronauts on Skyab used it. Crew members on the International Space Station requested it. The reason was practical. In microgravity, the human sense of taste dulls significantly. Food that seems adequately seasoned on the ground tastes flat in orbit. A few drops of concentrated pepper heat solved the problem. Tabasco became, without anyone planning it, the condiment of choice for human beings living off the planet. On the ground, the brand embedded itself into American food culture through a strategy of co-branding that was unusual for a company of its size. McIlhenny Company licensed the Tabasco name and flavor to dozens of major food producers. Slim Jim beef sticks, Spam, Heinz ketchup, Cheez-It crackers used Tabasco green pepper formulation for years. The product showed up in branded popcorn, chocolate, mustard, steak sauce, jelly, and Bloody Mary mix. Each partnership put the name in front of consumers who might never have picked up the original red container on their own. The product line itself expanded carefully. For more than a century, McIlhenny produced only the original red. Then in measured steps, they introduced variations. Jalapeno, Chipotle, Habanero, Sriracha, a scorpion pepper edition. Each new flavor used different peppers, but the core method, fermentation, aging, vinegar blending, remained consistent across the range. The original red never lost its position at the center. The variations existed around it like satellites, extending reach without diluting identity. In 2009, Queen Elizabeth II granted McIlhenny Company a royal warrant. The designation certified Tabasco as a supplier of pepper sauce to the British royal household. It was one of roughly 850 such warrants worldwide, and it placed a Louisiana operation alongside centuries-old European firms that supplied tea, biscuits, and champagne to the crown. The warrant was not honorary. It meant the product was actually being used and reordered by the royal kitchens, a condiment invented by a ruined banker on a Gulf Coast salt dome seasoning meals at Buckingham Palace. What explains the longevity is not marketing. Many has never had the advertising budget of a Heinz or a Coca-Cola. The explanation is architectural. Edmund's original design decisions made out of necessity rather than strategy turned out to be structurally perfect for global expansion. The concentrated formula means a tiny amount goes a long way. The small container travels easily and stores indefinitely. The sprinkler top prevents waste and controls dosage. The flavor is strong enough to register across any cuisine, but neutral enough not to overwhelm any dish. It works on eggs in Texas and pro in Hanoi and pasta in Rome. That versatility was not engineered. It was accidental. And no competitor has been able to reverse engineer the combination of simplicity, portability, and universal compatibility that makes it work. Hundreds of hot sauce brands have launched since Edmund filled his first batch. A few have built significant businesses. Frank's Red Hot and Sriracha each found large audiences, but none of them have matched the geographic spread, the cultural penetration, or the sheer staying power of the original. Tabasco is not the hottest sauce. It is not the cheapest. It is not the trendiest. It is the one that is already on the table when you sit down in a restaurant you have never visited in a country you have never been to before. That kind of presence takes more than a good product. It takes 150 years of never changing the product. Chapter 10. The Island That Refuses to Sink. Edward Avery Many spent his life trying to protect the natural world. He also accidentally unleashed one of the most destructive invasive species in North American history. Both of those things happened on the same piece of ground. Ned, as everyone called him, was a paradox. The man who ran Many Company for half a century was also, and perhaps more genuinely, a naturalist. He had explored the Arctic twice before the age of 30. He collected rare plants from around the globe and cultivated them in a 170-acre private garden he called Jungle Gardens. He studied birds with an obsessiveness that bordered on the scientific. Between 1912 and 1942, he personally banded more than 286,000 birds for tracking and research. His most celebrated conservation effort began around 1895 when he noticed that snowy egrets on the estate were vanishing. Hunters were killing the birds in enormous numbers to sell their plumage for women's hats. The fashion industry's appetite for feathers had pushed the species toward extinction. Ned responded by establishing Bird City, a protected rookery on the grounds where egrets could nest and breed without interference. Theodore Roosevelt, who visited and knew the family through John, called it the most noteworthy wildlife reserve in the country. Ned then persuaded other major landowners, including the Rockefeller Foundation, to set aside additional coastal marshland. By the time he was done, nearly 175,000 acres of Louisiana wetland had been placed under protection. The same man who saved the snowy egret also brought the nutria to Louisiana. In 1938, Ned purchased a group of the large South American rodents from a breeder and established a farm on the estate. His reasoning was straightforward. Louisiana's fur trapping industry was profitable, and nutria pelts seemed like a promising addition. He was not the first person to bring the animal to the state. Other breeders had been experimenting with nutria since the early 1930s, but Ned was the most prominent, and his operation was the one that mattered most. The animals bred faster than anyone anticipated. Their pens could not contain them. On June 1, 1940, Ned released approximately 20 of them into the surrounding marsh. In 1945, he freed his entire remaining stock, publicly encouraging the idea that nutria would benefit Louisiana by establishing a new fur industry. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Without natural predators, the population exploded. By the late 1950s, an estimated 20 million nutria had spread across the coastal wetlands. They devoured native marsh grasses, stripped root networks from the soil, and burrowed into levees and drainage infrastructure. When the fur market collapsed in the 1980s, there was no longer any economic incentive to trap them. The population surged again. Louisiana has lost more than 2,000 square miles of coastline since 1932. And while nutria are not the only cause, their relentless feeding has accelerated the destruction significantly. The state now pays a $6 bounty per tail, employing local trappers to harvest roughly 400,000 animals a year just to hold the damage steady. Ned died in 1949, the same year Walter took control of the company. He never saw the full consequences of what he had released. But the irony remained sharp. The conservationist who saved a bird species from extinction also introduced a rodent that has done more damage to Louisiana's coastal ecosystem than almost any other single factor. That ecosystem is the same one protecting the Machini operation from the Gulf of Mexico. In 2005, Hurricane Rita drove a storm surge across the Louisiana coast that came within inches of the factory. Inches. The entire production facility, the barrel warehouses, the bottling lines, the pepper seed vaults nearly drowned. The damage would have ended more than a century of continuous production on the same ground. The response was a 17-foot earthen levee built around the 40 acres containing the factory at a cost of $5 million. It is functional, not elegant. A dirt wall standing between a $2 to $3 billion enterprise and the next Category 4 hurricane. Behind that wall, the same barrels still age. The same mash still ferments. The operation continues as if the Gulf were not creeping closer every year. Harold Osborne, who goes by Took, became president and CEO in 2019. He is Edmund McIlhenny's great-great-grandson. He holds a master's degree in environmental science from Oxford. The man now running the company has the academic credentials to understand exactly how precarious the situation is. Louisiana's coast is not stabilizing. The marshland that buffers the factory from storm surges is thinner than it was a decade ago. Sea levels are rising. Hurricanes are intensifying and the nutria are still out there, still feeding, still undermining the root systems that hold what remains of the wetlands together. The company's response has been characteristically quiet. McIlhenny funds volunteer marsh grass planting programs across 30,000 acres of surrounding wetland. They have invested in coastal restoration research. Osborne has described the effort as probably a standoff in a state that has lost 2,000 square miles of coast. Holding your ground counts as a victory. The succession of leadership tells its own story. After Walter died in 1985, his nephew Edward McIlhenny Simmons ran the company until his death in 2012. Paul McIlhenny, who had led the operation since 1998 and once reigned as Rex, the king of Carnival at Madera in 2006, died of a heart attack in 2013 at 68. Tony Simmons took the presidency in 2012. Osborne followed in 2019. For leadership transitions in 3 decades, each one passing to another branch of the same extended clan. No outside CEO has ever held the position. No board has ever voted to sell. In 2009, Queen Elizabeth II granted McIlhenny Company a royal warrant, certifying it as a supplier of pepper sauce to the British royal household. It was one of roughly 850 such warrants worldwide. A small family-held company on a sinking salt dome in southern Louisiana, recognized by the British Crown. Edmund would not have understood it. He probably would not have cared. 700,000 bottles still roll off the line every day. The factory still sits on the same ground where Edmund first crushed peppers in 1866. The salt column beneath it is still rising slowly, even as the marshland around it sinks. The oak trees still stand. The egrets still nest in Bird City. And somewhere in the tall grass at the edge of the bayou, the nutria are still chewing. The McIlhennys are still there. They have outlasted the Civil War, the collapse of the Southern economy, 30 years of trademark litigation, 2 world wars, 5 hurricanes, and 20 million rodents. They have done it by refusing to sell, refusing to relocate, refusing to change the recipe, and refusing to believe that a 2,000-acre salt dome surrounded by disappearing wetlands is anything other than home. I started this project because a man did not write about the thing that made his name immortal. That gap between what Edmund McIlhenny built and what he thought he built is for me the center of the whole story. He was a banker who became a refugee who became a condiment maker almost by default. He never called himself an entrepreneur. He never described a grand ambition. He sealed bottles with green wax, shipped crates to grocers, and tracked payments in a ledger. The product he considered a practical solution to a temporary problem has now outlasted every bank he ever owned by more than a century. What strikes me most is not the scale of what followed. It is the stubbornness. Generation after generation looked at the same recipe, the same aging process, the same small glass container, and decided that nothing needed to change. That decision made again and again across 150 years of family ownership is rarer than it sounds. The pressure to modernize, to diversify, to sell to a larger corporation, to move production somewhere cheaper and safer must have been enormous at times. Every generation pushed back against it. Edmund McIlhenny never imagined any of this. He took some peppers, mixed in salt and vinegar, and poured the result into whatever small bottles he could find. He was not founding a dynasty. he was keeping his household afloat. Sometimes that is how the most permanent things begin. Not with a vision, with a necessity that nobody thinks to question. And by the time anyone realizes what it has become, it is already too deep in the ground to pull.